Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com. Ozcast.
Welcome to Strategicon.
Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. So before we begin, I'd like to welcome back to Strategicon returning guest Purnendra Jain.
Thank you, John.
Purnendra is Emeritus Professor at the University of Adelaide and is also Sage International's Head of Research and Academic Development and member of Sage's Advisory Board. And also in the studio today, our Strategicon producer Michael McGarley.
Hello, how are you guys?
Good.
Thank you.
Co-host David Olney is on leave, currently completing his university studies on strategic communication, but we hope for him to be back with us soon. Today's topic will be India, the Quad, and the Russia-Ukraine war. Over the past 20 years, India has gradually moved to engage the international community as a global great power, while retaining its long-held notion of strategic autonomy born out of its history as a non-aligned state during the Cold War. India has good working relations with the United States and its close Indo-Pacific partners, Japan and Australia, through the Quad, while at the same time continuing to enjoy close and meaningful relations with the Russian Federation. But is this a balancing act that is bound to fail? Can the Modi government sustain its middle path between two diametrically opposed camps, one led by the United States, the other by Russia? Purnendra, can you explain for our listeners just how fundamental the Russia-India relationship is?
Thanks, John. Yes, it's quite fundamental in the sense that, India-Russia relationship is time-tested and enduring. And it's not in the last 10 years or 20 years, but we are talking about decades of this relationship. So it's very strong, and I won't call it a strengthening, but still strong. And it has got a history behind it. Because going back into the 1960s or 1970s, for example, when India was a non-aligned country, and when it faced with war with China and later on with Pakistan, then India found then Soviet Union as a true friend to India. And in 1971, at the time of the Pakistan war between East and West Pakistan, when Bangladesh was created, India was partly or kind of fully involved in that war. And it didn't see any response from the U.S. Rather, the U.S. was supporting Pakistan, West Pakistan, at that time. So at that time, Russia came to India's assistance and help. And then India was able to achieve its goal, that was the creation of Bangladesh. So we can see in that perspective that how India-Russia relations have developed in strategic terms, but also if you look at economic terms. Russia and India have been great trading partners, and it was ruble-rupee trade between these two countries that helped India because India did not have much foreign exchange reserve at that time, so it was very helpful for India to have this kind of relationship with Russia. And also if you look at, people-to-people relationship, a lot of Indian students studied in Russian universities then, in agriculture, in other engineering, in science and medicine. So that was quite helpful, and lots of Russians also came to India. So that's the background in which India's relationship with Russia now and the Soviet Union in the past developed. And it continues. It has weakened to a certain extent, but it continues to the extent that India is very close to Russia. And one of the reasons being that Russia is the largest supplier of arms to India. Some calculations told us about 80% of India's current arms stock is Russian. And of course, India needs servicing them, spare parts. So it cannot just, all of a sudden weaken its relationship with Russia and leave Russia. So I think the relationship is still continuing. It's very important for India.
You raised Pakistan earlier, and I'm curious what your take is with regard to a sort of shift in Islamabad's outreach to Washington following the end of the Khan government, the government of Imran Khan. Imran Khan was noted to be very pro-China in his sentiments. The new regime seems to be less so. Is this a way of applying American pressure on India to prevent it from getting too close to Russia, in spite of the fact that the United States recognizes what you've just said, and that is that India can't simply turn its back on Russia?
I think Pakistan is a factor, and we just can't look at the U.S. as an external power in the South Asian region. China, as you have mentioned, comes in a big way as well. And as you alluded, China-Pakistan relationship has been very, very strong, very important from Pakistan's perspective and also from China's perspective, because by befriending Pakistan, China is trying to put pressure all the time on India. So that factor remains. But when you talk about the former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who was recently defeated, his narrative is that this was all U.S. Sponsored, and U.S. was trying to get him out of power and bring a new government who was more friendly, or who could be more friendly to the U.S. We don't know exactly whether that is going to happen, whether Pakistan is all of a sudden going to be very friendly with the U.S. But certainly the signals are there that the relationship between U.S. and Pakistan may improve, and then China will, be concerned about this new development in Pakistan, because that weakens China's strategic, maneuvering in the South Asian region.
The last round of the Leaders' Summit of the Quad in Tokyo last month gave observers the impression that all was well with the grouping. New Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was seen taking the congratulatory bouquets from his Quad colleagues, and in many ways the arrival of Albanese was a pleasant distraction to Quad proceedings. How many sidebars would Biden have had with Modi regarding India's refusal to publicly chastise Russian President Vladimir Putin on his invasion of Ukraine?
I don't know what went inside meeting rooms in Tokyo. I'm sure lots of things happened inside, but from outside, if you look at their introductory remarks and also the joint statement, we know Russia didn't figure in the joint statement, and Russia was not mentioned by Modi in particular. It wasn't mentioned even by the Australian Prime Minister. But others did mention, the two other leaders did mention about the Ukraine war. And so what went inside the meeting rooms, we don't know. But my guess is that the other three Quad partners, that is the US, Japan, and Australia, they understand India's position vis-a-vis Russia. So they don't want to raise that question, because I think the Indian government might have already explained what is their Russia's policy and why they are not directly criticizing Russia on this particular issue. But that hasn't meant that India has been weak, because it has, in various bilateral settings, has said that any change in the status quo is not good. So yes, so I think the other three Quad partners, they have come to realize that we cannot convince, persuade, or force India to criticize Russia and to vote against Russia in the United Nations. So those things are not good. India has also said that the Quad is about the Indo-Pacific.
Now, hang on a sec. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, the Quad is...
The Quad is about the Indo-Pacific,
yes,
and yet Russia is also an Indo-Pacific player, right?
Well, yeah, but the Indo-Pacific as defined in the context of the Quad is the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean.
Which, of course, Russia has no interest in.
Well, no. It's not that not interested in. But what the Indian government, in my view, is arguing that this is not the remit of the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. The remit of the Quad is the Indo-Pacific. So of direct concerns are nations which are in the Indian Ocean and in Pacific, right? And from India's point of view, Europe, Atlantic, Europe and Russia, maybe they are not part of this Indo-Pacific. In any case, we know that Russians have been against the idea of this free and open Indo-Pacific, as are Chinese. So China and Russia, as you have said, that maybe Russia is part of the Pacific, but for them, they have criticized the concept of Indo-Pacific as anti-China and pro-West. So they have been telling India not to go close to this particular ideas and concept. So it doesn't mean that India has accepted what the Russians have always told India to do. So they have done what they think is their national interest. And not to criticize and to abstain in the UN voting, India would say that this is in our national interest. So we are working in our national interest. But that doesn't mean that they are not working closely with the Quad partners.
It's interesting that you should say this, because there'll be a lot of people out in the international relations firmament who believe that it's not really good for India to have it both ways, that there is a sense of you're either with us or you're against us. And unfortunately, from my LinkedIn network, I'm getting a lot of, shall we say, bite back when these kind of issues do come up. And that's okay. I mean, it's all part of the dialogue I like to indulge in. But nonetheless, there are people out there who really do think that, the Indians should now... they're of a strategic maturity that they should just say, look, yes, Russia was important to us over a period of time. It is no longer important to us, and we're going to start buying our weapons, maybe not from the United States because they're too expensive, but from, second-tier European countries which are a little bit more affordable. And we can start moving away from Russia in a way that will make sense to the West and giving more coherence to India's position within the Quad framework.
I mean, India has, as some have put it, that India has walked on both sides of this street, if you like, right? So on the one hand, India engaged Russia and China through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's BRICS, which is, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And then the Quad and Indo-Pacific. So, one... kind of commentary could be, how can India be on both sides of this street and walk without any accident, right? So far that has worked for India. But the road ahead, whether the road ahead is still to walk on both sides of the street, is, I think, must be a question in the minds of Indian policymakers as to how they are going to navigate from now on, right? So, I mean, you said about diversifying or, in getting out of independence, getting out of dependence on Russian arms. That's not going to happen overnight or even in a year or 5 years, right? If you have got 80% of your stock Russian, even if you diversify, it will take decades for you to do. And India is now buying from Europe, buying from US, buying from Israel. So it's not that India is not diversifying, but its stock is still heavily Russian. And that situation is not going to change. The other thing is, India depends on Russia because Russia is one of the 5 members of the permanent members of the Security Council. And whenever India needs a veto in the Security Council, Russia comes to India's side. So India well recognizes the role of Russia in the United Nations as one of the 5 permanent members because, in India still the Kashmir issue is lingering.
Yeah.
And if it comes to a vote in the United Nations, India would like Russia to use its veto. So it's not just, the energy supply from Russia, not just the arms which India buys from Russia, but also Russia's importance in India's view in the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member of UNSC.
I was just thinking, India's position with regard to the Quad seems very reminiscent of Turkey's position with regard to NATO, although you could say that Turkey is taking a far harder line against its NATO partners as opposed to India against the Quad partners. But nonetheless, there's that sort of outlier capacity that Turkey plays within NATO. It buys Russian weapons. It shouldn't buy Russian weapons, but it buys Russian weapons. Erdogan is, creating a very independent sense of Turkish strategic identity in the Black Sea region and now pushing against Greece in the Aegean as well, which means that Turkey seems more and more of an ill-fitting ally as time goes on. Do you think that, and I mean, we have to also assume that in the domestic political evolution in India, that this will also happen to India over time as well? Because, India is not in a vacuum, neither is Turkey, and for every reaction, there's going to be a counter reaction to it. So how do you see India, not just the government of India today, but India moving forward into the future with all these pushing and pulling that's going on between, say, for instance, the Russians on the one side, the Americans on the other, India's practical ties to Russia, India's maybe narrative play with the West? How is that all going to sort of cohere into something that will really be an advantage for Indian national security moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of comparison with Turkey and NATO, Turkey is a member of NATO. The Quad is not an alliance, military alliance.
Yeah.
And India is not an ally of any country in international relations term, which means military alliance. So India has chosen the path of what they call multi-alignment, right? You can call it by any name, but this is what India would like to call multi-alignment, that we try to align with as many countries as possible. We have more friends and very few, if at all, enemies. So that's the kind of narrative or philosophy which India follows. So I think the comparison with Turkey does not hold there. But in terms of, what is India's path ahead? I think the path ahead in the next, 2 to 5 years, I don't see there will be much change in India's policy towards Russia or towards the US. But we may see more strengthening of the Quad. I mean, on Quad, commentators have got different views. But my own view is that we may see a strengthening of the Quad. And I think they have to strengthen their capacity in non-traditional security issues, which have got bearing on traditional security issues. So if you are doing something in cybersecurity, if you are doing something in climate change infrastructure, so in a sense they're trying to blunt what China is doing in these areas, in the South Pacific, for example, or in South Asia, for example. So through the Quad process, they can blunt China's approach and activity in non-traditional security areas. But that, as I said, that has got relevance for traditional security issues as well. So I give an example. South Pacific is in the news recently. Our foreign minister has been there and going again. So I was just wondering, what India and the Quad together can do in the South Pacific. I think there is a role for India there because India engages the countries of South Pacific, but I think it's not that intense. So the intensity needs to be accelerated, and also the four nations need to work out as to what is their strength, where they are strong, where they are weakness, or how they can use their strength to do something with the South Pacific. So I think that part is possible. But I don't think at the moment India will do anything with regard to Russia. It doesn't want to get involved in that part of the world.
Yes, that is true. You've raised a couple of things that I need to return to. Firstly, the South Pacific. So when we're looking at the South Pacific, India obviously has an interest in South Pacific countries that do have an Indian diaspora population. Say, for instance, Fiji.
Fiji, yeah.
So I suppose their greatest diplomatic efforts in the region will be toward Fiji rather than other South Pacific states. So for India to have a greater footprint in that region, it would have to develop a much broader sense of itself in the region. So it's not just about looking after, diaspora Indians and having a pecking order of priority. No. It has to be like, okay, this region is of strategic importance to India, and so therefore we need to, take the culture out of it and just look at it as a region that is of strategic import to New Delhi and its interests moving forward. Yeah. Do you see this happening in New Delhi?
Yeah, you have hit the nail on the head, exactly, John. I mean, India has, or any of the Quad countries, while they have got their own cultural and national interests, they need to think what as Quad their interest is and how they can put their energies together to produce synergy, which can be turned into actual, outcome.
Yeah.
Right? So if India just depends on Fiji and on its, diaspora, that's not going to help South Pacific. So India needs to bring its strength, whether it is in IT, whether it is in cybersecurity, whether it is police, whether it is personnel, human resources, because India is quite capable in some of these areas where it can bring those, services to these countries. It's not too expensive because India has developed its, IT in a way that this could be delivered, in a not very expensive way. So those are some of the areas where India can help, say, for example, Micronesian countries, nations, and other, South Pacific nations. So I think they need to work out together as to what Australia can do, what US can do, what Japan can do. I mean, Japan has got great investment in the South Pacific, and they know the South Pacific well. So I think the South Pacific situation can become much better through the Quad.
Yeah. Okay, well, we also raised another issue, and that was China and Russia in the Indo-Pacific. Their cooperation seems to also extend into joint military exercises designed specifically to intimidate Taiwan. Now, considering the fact that you were saying that from a Quad's perspective, the Quad has carved up the Indo-Pacific, it just means the Indian and Pacific Oceans and nothing else. Well, Taiwan sits in the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah.
Russia has a hand in helping China in whatever capacity it has its strengths in, to facilitate China's intimidation of Taiwan. Does this not actually bring with it some baggage that make the Indians very uncomfortable? Because if, as you say, in the Quad, the Americans, Australians and Japanese understand India's dilemma by having been and continuing to be connected to Russia in a very profound way. They also know that that relationship will probably crumble under the weight of the internal contradictions when Russia then does decide to back China overtly in a military push against Taiwan.
Yeah.
So really, again, the Quad may be an embryonic structure and still has a long way to go to mature, but India does sort of sit like a shag on a rock against, the Western element of it.
On the Taiwan question, so far India hasn't made anything clear, right?
Yeah.
But my view, my assessment is that if China uses force and the US helps Taiwan, Japan helps Taiwan, I think India will go with them. What they can do, I'm not sure, but they will not criticize, they will not abstain, and they will help as much as they can, assist militarily. Because given China-India relations, India would not like to see China doing anything which disturbs their status quo. So my view is maybe Washington, Joe Biden and Kishida and our Prime Minister, they might have a discussion on this issue inside the room on the Taiwan question. And my guess is that India would have given some kind of assurance that, look, that's part of the Indo-Pacific and we would like to see law and order maintained, status quo being maintained, and if something goes wrong, then India will consider its options very, carefully. And I think that's the real test for the Quad, the Taiwan issue.
Another highly complicating issue, of course, is the fact that Russia supplies weapons and aerospace technologies to both China and India. I suppose the Russians are using this as a way to hedge its own bets within that triangular relationship. So, to prevent one from getting too strong, they can always threaten to pull supply and then give to the other to reacquire a sort of balance, if you will. Again, under current international conditions, this seems like a very risky proposition because I think that at some point in the current chaos in the international climate, we may see the country of Russia, India and China having to make very hard decisions. I mean, we don't live in the pre-2014 days where people can fiddle around the edges all they like and not be held to account, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Russia, China, India, kind of this triangle, if you like, is quite complicated.
Yeah.
As you have put it, Russia-China relations, Russia-India relations. But if you look at the history of Russia-China relations, they have gone through, up and down. Friends and enemies and friends and enemies and again friends. You don't see that kind of relationship between India and Russia. It has been very consistent and it has been quite strong. So I don't think Russia will do something with China which will negatively impact India.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. Going back to the scenario that I suggested earlier with regard to Taiwan, if Russia were to officially pair itself up with China against Taiwan, this will put India under severe pressure because, I mean, and we will return to this, over 80% of their armed forces is dependent on Russian weapons. It's unlikely that Russia will be in the position to supply India with weapons when they're fighting a hot war with the Chinese over Taiwan.
I don't know about this. I don't think Russia and China have reached any, or they have stated anything about Taiwan. So Russians have not committed anything on Taiwan, right?
Right.
They haven't. So I don't know, and I doubt whether Russians will then side with China if China tries to forcefully assimilate Taiwan in its territory. So there, and we know that Russia-China relations at the moment are a relationship of convenience, right? Anti-West narrative and anti-Indo-Pacific, Quad, all these things, they bring them together. But whether Russia-China relationship will strengthen and Russia will be with China when China decides to invade Taiwan, maybe not.
Taking a step back and then seeing it from another perspective, India and China have had their clashes in the Himalayas. And if things remain as they are internationally and the Chinese say, well, look, it's a bit too difficult for us to go after Taiwan, but we sure as hell can go after the Indians over the Himalayas, where do you think Russia would sit on that in terms of supplying both the Chinese and the Indians with weapons over a war? I mean, we've seen this kind of dynamic before when during the Iran-Iraq war, where the Americans were supplying both sides in the hope that they'll both exhaust themselves. Do you see the Russians playing a similar kind of role?
I don't think so. That's not my assessment. I may be wrong. But, China and India, they have had small skirmishes. They had a small kind of mini war in 2020 as well. So I don't think Russia took any side at that time, 2020 either. So if there is a war or a mini war between China and India, I think Russia will sit as a neutral country. It's not going to support one or the other. But certainly India will expect from the Quad nations to give at least moral support to India, which has been lacking in the past. The US was very reluctant to directly support India against China. So was Japan, so was Australia. I think that has changed now. So if China does anything which harms the interests of India, then my feeling is that the Quad nations will come morally and they will morally support India. They will not keep quiet. They will not be neutral. Otherwise, the whole Quad comes apart and trust of India in the West will again be lost.
I think it's always going to be a risk for India so long as they're perceived, not they are, but they're perceived to be sitting on the fence on both of these very starkly different camps.
Yeah. It's true. I agree with you. You can't be friends to all in international relations, right? As in real life, I think.
So, I'm friends to all.
You can be friends to all when there are no frictions between other players. But now we are seeing clear division between Europe, US, and Russia on the one hand, and China and US on the other hand. So if there is so much cleavage and division, then India needs to carefully assess its policy. And I won't be surprised if India is doing that, but they are not in the public yet. So when the penny drops, then we will know what India is going to do. So India was very clear on Russia and Ukraine and NATO, but when something happens in the Indo-Pacific region, then we will know which way India turns.
Okay. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs, and we're speaking with Emeritus Professor Purnendra Jain on India, the Quad, and India's delicate tightrope walk in keeping ongoing Russian and US relations from cancelling each other out. Purnendra, earlier we were mentioning about the fact that India's armed forces consist of, just over 80% of, the armed forces order of battle with Russian military technology. How do you think senior Indian officers are seeing Russia's war on Ukraine? I mean, are they worried that their reliance on cheap Russian equipment has left their armed forces open to similar operational deficiencies as the Russians have encountered in Ukraine?
There are two levels to your question. One is about Russia's military intervention in Ukraine. There is a narrative in India, quite strong actually, that Russia was almost forced to go into military action. And this was because NATO was expanding itself.
The Mearsheimer debate.
Yeah. So that is a very strong narrative in India, even among military and Army, Navy, Air Force kind of. I've been listening to some of the presentations by, if not serving, recently retired senior military officers. The second part of this question is about the reliability of arms from Russia. And that's a question they might be now asking themselves, that to what extent these are reliable arms. But so far, India has had good experience, and we know that India has recently ordered, what's it called, S-400 or something.
Oh, yeah, S-400. Yeah.
S-400.
Yeah.
So still India is buying in a big way from Russia. So obviously, they have tested Russia's arms, and they are happy, and they are buying more. But whether they will keep buying more, maybe not. They want to diversify. But as you mentioned in the beginning, they find other countries' arms very expensive, right? So cost is a big factor for India. Yeah. So if Western countries can provide India cheaply, then I think India will go and buy from them.
Well, we can't even afford the weapons here, and when we do,
so for India, it's a very difficult call.
Yeah, exactly. And when we sign up to various Western procurements and they fall over, it costs us billions.
Yeah.
So there's another issue at stake, and that would be the Indians. Obviously, are caught up like the rest of the world in the whole strategic dynamic of the Russia-Ukraine war. It's not just a war on the battlefield of Ukraine, it's also having an effect on the international order. The most important thing of which, of course, is it's threatening energy and energy supply as well as the supply of grain and cooking oil. Two of the most vital components in most developing worlds. Actually, I won't even say developing world. It's important for everybody, right? So India has recently banned the export of its grain, which means now we no longer have Russian grain, we no longer have Ukrainian grain, and we no longer have Indian grain. What's the sort
of... We have Australian grain.
Oh, yeah, that's gonna work. At the moment we're going through floods, so I don't know how good the harvest is going to be this year. But Australia really has to be taken out of the equation because we have such variable climate. So there may be 2 or 3 good years, and then we'll have 5 bad years for either drought reasons or flooding reasons. But with India now also out of the market, that takes 3 major players out of the grain market internationally. What do you think the impact is going to be globally as a consequence of India's decision?
Well, we are already witnessing the impact of this. Lots of Southeast Asian countries, also in Africa and elsewhere, this will affect quite significantly. But as I understand, the Indian government response is that they had a bad crop this year.
Right.
And, this is very political because India and its Prime Minister Narendra Modi, they are so much domestically focused for their own party and for their political purposes that they cannot afford to make any policy which disadvantages its own population, and then you export things for foreign exchange. Yeah. So I think it's very clear, the narrative is very clear that we don't have enough ourselves, and so we have put a ban on export. I think it's wheat, not all grain. I think wheat in particular.
Yeah.
So we are already witnessing the shortage of wheat and flour throughout the world. And as you said, with Ukraine in crisis and Russia's ban on Russia, that has complicated the problem even more. But how we are going to come out of this, I really don't know. I'm not an expert in that area, John.
All right. Well, Purnendra, 2 final questions to wrap things up. We have we have this international sanctions regime imposed upon Russia. But India hasn't signed up to it.
No.
China hasn't signed up to it. That's the world's two largest countries, as well as much of the developing world who haven't signed up to these sanctions. I mean, this sanctions regime is really an American-led, EU-followed, and plus Australia, Japan, right? So, but the advanced economies have banded together to use their clout against the Russians. But this is, obviously this huge gap where you've got China, you've got India, you've got much of Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, who haven't signed up to anything. That gives the Russians a lot of leeway to get out of the sanctions regime. I mean, they're not going to be getting a lot of money out of the West, but surely they'll get enough money to make, to keep things going for themselves from the rest of the world, right? Mm-hmm. So the Biden administration can't be happy about this, that India is sort of playing its part in this Russia get-out-of-jail-free position. So do you think that Washington has a fair amount of heartburn over this issue?
They might have heartburn, but they can't do much about it.
Right.
Because they cannot force India. And India has made its position very clear. In the media, we heard a lot about India's dependence on Russian energy, oil in particular. The foreign minister of India came out and gave some statistics. And he said that India buys only 4 to 5% of its energy requirement from Russia. And look at Germany, for example. Yeah. So he gave examples of, it's a kind of counterattack on NATO and Europe and the US. So what he was saying that, look, we don't depend so much. It's you who depend more. So whatever you want to do. But meanwhile, India has increased its import from Russia, its oil. But it's not a significant increase, but some increase. Because India has got this crunch to buy cheap oil from Russia or to go for more expensive oil elsewhere. And India being still a kind of middle-range developing country, it doesn't have resources to buy oil somewhere else which is more expensive only for political reasons. And then that's going to send wrong signals to Russia as well, which India doesn't want.
Right. Finally, the other issue of significance, and one that you discussed in your latest op-ed for the University of Melbourne's Asia Link, is the balancing act needed for Narendra Modi to continue meaningful cooperation with the Quad without burning its relations with Russia. Is Modi capable of sustaining this balancing act? And if he is, would future Indian governments be able to also sustain this balancing act, assuming that the international crisis that we're currently in is only going to get worse?
So far, India has managed this balancing act. But going forward, they might be thinking what's the best course for them to do. I think maybe slowly they might reduce their dependence on Russia. It depends on the outcome of this Ukrainian crisis and Russian military, intervention in Ukraine. When it ends, what will be the shape of Russia then? Right? We don't know at this stage. And Russia-China relations. So I think for India it's a wait and watch game. And they might be planning something for the future. But I really don't know what they are planning. My view is that they might be planning or thinking how to reduce their dependence on Russia slowly.
Okay. Well, everyone, that's a wrap. My thanks to returning guest, Emeritus Professor Purnendra Jain, and producer Michael Magali for being with us today. And our thanks to the Ozcast Network. It was great being in the studio again.
Thank you, John and Michael.
Thank you very much.
To our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategicon through the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn and Spotify, and please like us on the Sage International Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can also watch our podcasts on video through the Strategicon Raw YouTube channel when they're available, easily accessed by clicking on the link provided on our website. Until next time, it's goodbye from me, John Bruni. You've been listening to Strategicon, a Sage International podcast.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.